As a small business owner, my favorite thing about posting a job on LinkedIn is that when I hit post, I clock out and LinkedIn clocks in.
LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, get qualified candidates, and manage them all in one place. Plus, LinkedIn extends the reach of your job post by allowing you to share it with your network. And hiring managers that add a hiring frame to their LinkedIn profiles receive 2 times more qualified applicants. Go to linkedin.com/achieve to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Manchester's indie rock and roll station, XS Manchester. The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salverson. XS Manchester.
Hello there, this is the XS Long Player, I'm Jim, and today's episode is going to be hard to beat. We said to ourselves we better do better, so we went to the cash machine, and I'm going to stop this now, because we have got Hard-Fi talking about their album Stars on CCTV, their debut on today's XS Long Player, and diving deep off that album. I'm sure you spotted the musical references I made a second ago, and it does the chat I'm about to have with Rich and Steve from Hard-Fi a disservice, because we go deep on this album. It's a great chat about the making of the band's debut, a massive album from the mid-noughties that was Mercury Music Prize nominated. It went to #1 in the album charts, sold over 1 million copies worldwide, so a few rubbish puns don't really do it service. What I didn't appreciate, though, was the humble beginnings of this album, and we'll get into that shortly on today's XS Long Player. So let's head to Staines and talk to Rich and Steve from Hard-Fi about Stars of CCTV. How you doing, boys?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. It's an exciting time for Hard-Fi, new music, anniversary tour as well. I'm curious which came first. Was it the anniversary and kind of getting back together and promoting new music, or was it the new music that kind of had you looking back at those early days in the mid-2000s and you went, actually, that was all right, let's do that again?
So it kind of goes back to lockdown, really, and in that period. I had been working on this project, and that wasn't Hard-Fi, it was a different thing, different people involved, and it kind of got sort of like kiboshed by the whole lockdown thing. But while we were trying to sort of keep that alive, we started doing as many people did, like those kind of live streams, things like that. So we did that for a bit, and I found that quite interesting. And then I decided to do a live stream of the whole of Stars of CCTV acoustically, and was kind of taken aback by the response, because it was such a really warm, heartfelt response, like a big response. There was a lot of love there, It's like, oh well, this is great, Maybe we should kind of, take this further, and when things kind of calm down a little bit, talk to the guys, talk to our agent, and so that was quite where it started. It was just about playing a gig. It was just about having some fun, really. There was no grand plan. I mean, to be honest with you, there still isn't a grand plan. It's still a little bit half-assed, but so it started like that. It was just about doing a show. And we picked a venue in London, because that's where always where our core support has been, and it sold out in 10 minutes. And then we were lucky enough to come and do the New Century Hall up here as well, which was a beautiful venue. So that was kind of how it started, and it was just like, okay, well, then let's put on some more dates. But then actually there was this feeling of like, well, we're kind of playing these old songs from 20 years ago or so. We really ought to have some new music, otherwise it's just a bit of a nostalgia thing. So then it was like, okay, come on then, let's here's some ideas, let's work these up. And that was why this new music is an EP, because it's just like, we want to have some new tunes, but sometimes making an album, it can end up being a bit of a weight, a millstone, so it was just nice to be a bit nimble and get some tunes out there, come and play some shows. And it just so happens that 2025 will be 20 years since we released Stars of CCTV, which is kind of scary. It's kind of just gone by so quick.
How much persuasion did the other guys need when you played the acoustic show and then you pick up the phone and go, I've got this idea, lads? How long did it take to convert?
Well, I didn't know what they'd say, because, everyone was doing other things. Everyone kind of moved on with their lives.
Well, musicians always like to look forward, I think, don't they? And it's like almost to the detriment of looking back sometimes.
Yeah. And but everyone was kind of up for it. I think, there'd been a long enough break between the last stuff we did to kind of remember what kind of good fun it was, and also just, that expressing yourself, is kind of quite good for the soul. And they were really just up for it. I think there was no real problems. And when we got into the rehearsal room for the first time, it was just a nice vibe. Everyone was chilled out. Everyone was, kind of like, back in the day, really, before, it's one of those things when we sometimes look back, the best times were before we got signed, because there was just, we had some amazing experiences we got to do some great things. But before, when it's just you against the world, it's kind of like, you remember it being like so exciting, going up to Portobello Market looking for clothes, doing stuff. It was kind of like being in the studio, our own little studio that we built, making music, and that was kind of just had a bit, I don't know, something real about it.
I want to talk more about the new stuff in a little bit, but first we are going to look back at the making of CCTV as an album, and take me back to those mid-2000s, before you were signed, as you said, before you stepped into the studio. What was life like for the band at that point? What were you doing? What was the day job? Did you feel like you were on the cusp of something, or was it still just messing around being in a band at that point?
So I was talking about this a little bit last night. It got to a point where we were sort of too busy to actually hold down a regular job. Me and Rich have been trying to get various music projects off the ground for years at this point, and we'd got really close a couple of times, been signed to labels and had a kind of a genuine shot at it, which had not really worked out. And so we were, we kind of knew what was at stake, because we still felt the sting of that a little bit. But I remember we were so busy doing stuff before we kind of saw any kind of way to pay ourselves, any kind of meagre wage, anything, that I was basically signing on the dole at that point, and I was going down to the dole office every week, and they were saying, right, well, how about there's a job at like some kind of local record shop or something like that, and I'm saying like, no, we've just had meetings with all of these various major record labels that existed at the time. I really think that this is actually going to come good. And they were like, well, that's great, it sounds good.
We've heard this before.
Yeah, that sounds really good, but but how about this? And so I had to sort of jump through all these hoops for them to try and like do all these other things and stuff like that, and go for loads of interviews and stuff. But really, we were pretty sure that something was going to happen at that point. And I remember actually going back to sort of sign off the dole after a while and saying, yeah, so just signed to Atlantic Records, thanks very much. And they were like, oh, really? Well done. And I was like, yeah, thank you. But that was it. We're kind of like, you're in a limbo sort of stage where you're really too busy with the band and everything else to do anything else, to hold down any proper job, but you're not really earning any money yet. It's kind of a really weird place to be in.
Before that, though, I mean, like, because after that, there was a band called Contempo that was signed to London Records. It was classic, it was kind of like a punk Northern Soul, wasn't it? Sort of a brass section.
Yeah.
That's where Steve and I first started working together. And we were like, here we are doing punk Northern Soul just when everyone's getting into French house. So everyone was into so we were like completely the wrong thing. And it didn't work out. Our label got bought by another one. The A&I guy got laid off. We got dropped. And at that point, it was pretty, my dad died as well. It was like pretty desperate times, because everything that you'd been dreaming of and working towards just kind of like disappeared. And there was the general sort of feedback that you got when you were trying to put something new together was, don't even bother. You've had your chance. Right. Tough luck. You didn't make it. That's it. Forget about it. That was why, I guess, at some, we were trying to rehearse. We were trying to find members for the band. It was just Steve and I. Rehearsal studios, there were no rehearsal studios where we were, so you had to kind of like drive an hour into town. And then by the time you get your stuff set up, have a cup of tea, and you have to pack up and come back. So we found this little taxi cab office that was, my mates were renting a room, and it was below them. And it was pretty dingy, pretty disgusting. Loads of it was back in the day when all the cabbies would sit and smoke all day in the things, like covered in nicotine. But we could rehearse there, and it was cheaper to rent this place and have a couple of rehearsals a week. So we were in there. The record was made before the label got involved. Right. Everything was going on before the major label got involved. The major label just came in and pressed a big cash button, basically. And we were lucky that at that label there were, really good people. We were working with, at that time, a bloke called Warren Clark had set up a company called Necessary Records. He's from round these parts. He had signed Contempo and then got as a junior and got laid off. So it was difficult. It was hard. When Steve was talking about this bit about talking to the label, that was kind of end games time, really. That was all kind of picking up. But prior to that, it was pretty kind of like literally doing something and having no idea whether anyone in the world would care. Yeah. And it took that record going to America and Rick Rubin saying, this is one of the best things I've heard in years, for then the labels in the UK to go, oh right, of course, because we weren't what was going on. We weren't the hip thing or whatever. We were doing our own thing. It took them saying that for them to come back and start listening to it. We had a few random endorsements like that on the first record, like Rick Rubin. Like, how did he even hear it? Elton John was like, this is a great album. George Michael, it was like weird, like people who, like, why
what?
Does it feel real when you get that?
It was weird. Like Elton John was like, this is a great album, best album I've heard in ages. And we were like, okay, thanks, Elton. Like, do you know what I mean? Appreciate that. Thank you. Do you know?
You say the kind of music you were making wasn't the cool thing at the time, but I think it's part of a scene at that period in time that kind of marked a change in terms of songwriting. So the 90s was very different to those early noughties, mid-noughties period where suddenly it was observations of normal life that you had in your music, and Arctic Monkeys had them a couple of years later when they followed up with their debut as well. Now, you're from Staines, obviously. That is down the road from where I grew up. I grew up in a place called Camberley, and I recognise, when listening back to that record, I recognise the people and I recognise the scenarios. And was that just what you assumed you'd write about? Or was there a conscious decision to go, we're going to write about the stuff outside our front door rather than maybe the flights of fancy or the kind of culture stuff that was more popular in the Britpop 90s era?
Yeah, I think that's just what came out. That just seemed to be the natural thing to do. You know, that was what, didn't know, because, you just didn't know what else to do, really. That just felt like the thing to do. I used to go to the Agincourt in Camberley, in that sort of heavy metal club.
Yeah. Sawdust dance floor.
Yeah, they always had a smell of vomit. Yeah. Great days. But yeah, no, that just felt like the thing. And we were, I do think timing is often a lot to do with it. And we obviously were at that moment where suddenly there were lots of great British bands coming through. There was a scene and there was a wave to ride, So we were lucky with that. But we weren't, if you think previous to that, I guess there would have been the Strokes and Frans and Libertines, all very kind of popular with the press. I think that was what we weren't. We weren't that kind of art school kind of thing.
No, but one of the things that Rich is really good at is telling stories that people can kind of connect to, if you like, stories within music that people can connect to. Sure. There's a feeling, especially in Stars of CCTV, there's a feeling that runs through that album which just, to a lot of people, just feels really familiar. And I think if you try and do that, you'll fail. So I think it just happened because it was real. Do you know what I mean? That's just being real and then bringing that out into music. Whether it's the good stuff or the bad stuff or just like the incidental bits and pieces that people can recognise. That's a skill in songwriting, definitely. But I think if you try and like make that, you've either got it in you or you don't, I think, basically. Even now, people, that album does bring back a lot of memories for people, either of that time or just feelings that they've felt once. You know what I mean? That's quite a special thing for me, I think.
When you look back at those topics you were discussing on that debut album, does it feel almost like a sense of frustration that the issues that you were talking about then that was kind of affecting young people, I guess, and also the bigger issues, like, and I remember read a load of interviews that you did back in 2005 and the album title hints at this, you're talking about the kind of the big brother nature of surveillance in the UK and how it compares to the elsewhere. The issues that you talked about there, and clearly the things that were rattling you, still feel very relevant and very prominent today. Does that feel like a sense of frustration almost?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you look back actually and you think, what were we moaning about? Because compared to today, it was pretty kind of like we were quite lucky, really. Yeah. I mean, obviously, like whether you're talking about in the CCTV and the surveillance, but you look at now how much how much a computer knows about what you do in your daily life through social media or whatever, and down to the culture things. When we were making that record in Staines, we'd always sort of say there's nothing to do, there's nothing going on, but there's even less now. There used to be a couple of pubs where people who were into sort of music we were into would go, and you could go and meet people, hear a band, chat, have a laugh, exchange ideas, and there'd be a nightclub which was classic, towny nightclub, chart house, but you could if you nod and a wink to the doorman, you could go in there and you could generally, there were still some places to go, and they've all gone now. There's a line on our new EP in the track Don't Go Making Plans, all these shut-up bars, nowhere too broke to eat, nowhere to dance, and that's how it feels. There's nowhere to go. People are just staying in, or they go to Wetherspoons because it's cheap. All that culture, all that kind of that's baked into the walls of those places just kind of is gone, and I think it's really sad.
I want to go back to something you were mentioning a moment ago, the cab office that you had as rehearsal rooms. We get a lot of people talking about studios when we do this show, and they'll be talking about something in LA and Hollywood or potentially trips to Rockfield or somewhere like that. So the album was actually recorded in this cab office.
Yeah.
When you listen back to the album now, bearing in mind it had those lo-fi surroundings, do you listen to it and kind of go, oh, we would have done this different if we'd had X budget or had the facilities available to do something a bit more expansive? Do you listen back to it and go, we would have loved to have done that? Or do you listen back to it and go, well, part of the charm of the record is the fact that it's got this slightly raw,
punky sound, I guess.
I mean, at the time, obviously, I probably would have loved to have had something, access to different things. But looking back now, it just suits it perfectly. I mean, funny enough, I was going back to through some of the old recordings that were basically where we'd got the idea down. So there's a guy called Wolsey White who is Stain's face. He was in a band called Supermodel, and I'd see him in the pub, and eventually I got chatting to him, and we'd chat. And it was when he came in really and sort of mixed what we'd done already that it started to take shape. So and it's kind of got a sound that's not perfect, but. And sometimes, like when we first put our stuff out, it didn't cut through on the radio as much because we were mixing it in a bedroom. We weren't mixing it in a properly treated room or anything. When we had to address that, but it's just got something about it that doesn't sound like anything else. And I think also that when you're in a big studio, you can start chucking loads of extra stuff on. Like the laptop we recorded it on that we had at the time, if you got more than 20 tracks on, it would crash. Whereas now with a laptop, you can do anything. You can do anything. You can get access. Music software comes with all these free things. Samples of esoteric instruments and exotic instruments and drum machines and everything. You can't. It's almost too much. You don't know where to start. Whereas we didn't have that. And going back and you listen to you just made it work. And you thought about, well, where should the guitar go against the vocal? Where should the bass go? So they've all got space and I think that kind of. Having those restrictions really, really helped it. And the fact that it gave us a chance to go in there and experiment. We weren't paying loads of money, try things out and enjoy the process as well. There was no pressure.
I've heard this about the record, and this might not be true, so I want to check it with you. Because if you don't know the geography, Staines is pretty close to Heathrow Airport, and I understand that on some tracks you can hear the planes going over on the flight path. I've listened and I can't find it. Is that true, and where is it?
There's definitely, isn't there?
Isn't it Move On Now? Is there one on that or something?
I don't know because it was so basically where the studio is. When we first went in there, it was a pretty small room, and Steve would set up in one corner, and what we'd do is we'd open the door, and outside was the corridor that took people upstairs, and it was just all concrete. So you put a mic out there, and it sounded like a lot bigger than the room that we were actually in. So it's on the tracks where there's obviously as the drums are going, and we've got the mic out there. And there was just a real flimsy door that was kind of like, we had the glass smashed half the time. So you'd often hear there's the postman coming in at one point. He walks in over some stairs, and you can hear the planes. And then there was also a busted water heater as well that was constantly dripping through it.
You probably can't make it out, but it's part of the DNA.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you exactly what track it would have been. It's probably on all of them.
When the album was released, it came out in a slightly unusual way. So I think you released or created batches of 1,000 at a time, and they quickly sold out, and then you'd maybe produce another 1,000 and they'd sell out. Was that a conscious thing that you the idea you had to create hype? Because I think that's what it did. It contributed to the hype. Or was it just a case of, we can afford 1,000, we're going to make 1,000?
So I mentioned earlier this guy, Warren, who he basically signed Contempo, got Contempo signed. He was out of work and he decided to set up his own label. And, he was pretty skint as well. So literally the 1,000 CDs is what he could afford. And when it first came out, no one wanted them. We had loads of them. And it was only kind of when, like we say, that started getting out to places and, reaching people, like went out, as I say, to the States, and people heard it back there. And then this interest came in that suddenly...
We got the original Cash Machine video got played on MTV, didn't it? Yeah. And that was a big turning point. Stuff like that. We liked the original Cash Machine video, which was again very DIY, like the album. That got played on MTV, and that made a big difference. And then things started to pick up. Which before we released the album through a major record label, we released sort of a mini version of it, if you like, through that independent label, through kind of our own label. Yeah, and I think they just did 1,000, and then at some point made another, and then at some point made another, and then things were rolling a little bit.
At the time, these sort of like independent music radio stations was called XFM, which I think sort of evolved into Radio X and all that sort of stuff. And it got taken in there, and it was like those days, this thing you could go in up to the desk and give a CD and then listen to it. Which is kind of unheard of now, really. Yeah. And I remember we'd phone in and go, have you got the Hi-Fi record? And they'd like, no, mate, never heard of it. And then the next day they played it. And people just started calling in, going, "What's this?" And then, suddenly, like they're playing it more and more, and then things started to kind of snowball from there on.
When did you first realise that something special was happening with it?
I think, from my point of view, anyway, it was through gigs. So it was like we were playing gigs to like, you know, no one at first. And then we were doing support slots. And then we had our own tours where it was like 300 people or something like that. And people, you know, we were selling them out. People were coming down. There was more people that wanted to come in. And I was like, okay, people want to hear this, fine. And then we did more gigs. The gigs got to like 700, something like that. And I was like, well, okay. There's more people again. And they got bigger, and that kind of happened. And so I was like, well, obviously something's happening. It felt like something was happening. People were talking about the music to us after the gigs and what it meant to them and stuff like that. But then it would be, because I'm the drummer, no one recognises me, right? So they don't know who I am. Rich is much more recognisable, or at least, maybe not now, Rich, but certainly was back in the day. But I would go in shops and stuff, and I'd hear people talking about it and stuff like that, and they'd be talking about it around me, and it was just people on the streets talking about the music that I was playing, but they didn't know that it was me.
That must be kind of otherworldly. It was like an out-of-body experience.
But that was it. That was the thing that really, like, it was like, oh, wow. I think I was in a club once and one of our tracks came on and people were going mental. And I was just like, okay. And I think I was in a hairdresser's once and, like, it came on and, like, the guy was singing along and stuff like that. And I was just like, I never used to tell him that I was in the band. I'd just keep quiet and observe. And it was that kind of, like, when it sort of got into the streets, if you like. Yeah. That was the turning point for me.
Did it feel seismic at the time? Because you look back at that album, number one album, Mercury Music Prize nominated, led to a record-breaking residency at Brixton Academy. It was a massive album. When you were in the middle of that, did you go, well, this is big, this is weird, this is unusual? Or now is it only with 20 years space that you look back and go...
It did a little bit, but what I did certainly, and I think Rich maybe had a similar experience, because of, like, the near misses, if you like, in the past where I've been in bands and it's not similar to Rich as well. Like, I wanted to be like a drummer in a, like, for a living, if you like, since I was about 6 years old. And, you know, I'd moved to London at 17 to do it, and I'd done all this kind of stuff. It'd been my life. And every time, when it got bigger and then bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, I was just fixated with not messing it up, really. It's like, okay, can't mess this up, got to do this, got to be on this, got to keep moving. What did we do last night that didn't go very well? Right, got to fix that, got to do better. Like, constantly, I was like that. I was probably a real pain to be around, if I'm honest.
I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves that was, you know, I guess, listen, it paid off, I guess, but sometimes I think it'd been we should have stopped and looked around a few more times and just went, wow, this, you know... But also, because it was quite incremental, wasn't it? It was like, oh, you've sold out this show, and we put this one on, and now that one's sold out. And gradually, like, the venues got bigger from a few hundred to 1,000 to, like, 3 nights at the Astoria in London. You know, like, and it just was like, oh, this is almost like. So by the time it got to kind of, you know, and then the Mercury Prize was a weird one, wasn't it? Because we never expected to win. We never expected to get nominated. We never expected to win it. And then it turns out we heard through some of this real convoluted thing that. We met one of the judges who was now a celebrant at a friend's mum's funeral. Okay. And he was like, you were literally missed out by 1 vote. You know, you were going to win it. I said,
it's normally the death knell, isn't it, of winning the Mercury.
Yeah, maybe it was a good thing that we didn't.
I said to him, who did you vote for? And he went, oh, Anthony Johnson.
Yeah, no tip. But I did enjoy it, obviously, and we did stop and pause and think about the enormity of it all. But with that came, don't mess up. Like, and that was the thing that I was really feeling. So I was uptight a lot. And so when I think back to it now, you know, I can remember feeling like that. And so instead of being like, we had the best time doing this, it was, right? It was. I'm not saying it was bad, but it was also a time of, like, intense pressure and scrutiny put on by ourselves. And no one was really advising us to not do that either. Like no one was there saying, guys, chill, it's going to be all right. That we were kind of like, everyone was in the same boat, really.
Well, also because we became, so we'd signed to Atlantic Records, which was at that point, obviously the name Atlantic has this long history, but this iteration of it was quite recent, and they made us an international priority, right? Which basically means that Atlantic was part of Warner Brothers, so every Warner Brothers around the world had to kind of punt our record and try and organise something to go on. So we were, like, kind of in demand, and. There was never, you looked at the diary, if there was a day off, it got filled. You know, it was like we'd go to America and we'd do 5 gigs in a row with about 5 hours of promo every morning, and then there'd be a day off, And they say, oh, by the way, that day off, can you go fly across the country and do this really important TV show? And by the way, don't screw up. You know, it was kind of like pretty intense, and we were shattered as well. So obviously, some of my favourite memories was going to places that I'd never been. So I'm certainly not going to, you know, disregard that, because I loved going to America. I loved going to Australia and Japan. Japan was incredible. I loved going around Europe. You know, it was brilliant. I loved all that. But it was like literally, you know, full on all the time. Yeah.
Once we'd done like a UK tour into a European tour, I think another UK tour, and then an American tour, and then we flew. It was either we might have gone to Japan, or we might have just, I think we were in America anyway, and then we flew to Australia. And when we landed in Australia, there was like interviews lined up to do when we landed. It was just like, oh my God, you know. I mean, I don't want to look back on that and being like, that was outrageous, because people are interested in us, and that's amazing, you know. But like we were doing too much.
I do think there is, like, you know, because there's a mental health aspect to it, that it's all very well, and I know you can't. It's hard to blame the people at the label, because they're just doing their job. You know, that they've been told they've got to get you in, so you fit you in here, there, and the other. You know, you're not going to be your best for everything.
Sure.
Something's going to give somewhere. Something's going to fall down at some stage. You know, I lost my mother in the June of 2005, and it was literally like, right, well, listen, you can't stop. You've got to keep going. And I agreed with that, because like, this is what I'd always wanted to do. This is, I knew that if my mum was able to say anything, she'd say, no, you've got to keep going. But it was just like, keep going. It was just kind of like, wow, this is, you know, but, you know, it was good, but I just think, you know, sometimes you've got to take control about it. Take control of it somewhere. Someone needs to take control and say, hang on a minute, otherwise this is going to burn out.
Look at us now, like, well rested, all killer, no filler. Do you know what I mean?
To go off piece slightly with this, what you're describing there feels relentless. Do you think that impacted what happened next? Because some great music followed this album, like album number 2, etc. There was some really good music on there, but you struggled to replicate the success you had with the debut. Do you think that was because you just didn't have the time to consider it properly, to make it in the way you would have wanted to make it?
Well, there was definitely the case in that everyone says that you have your whole life to write your first album. And then we came to make the second one, and being idiots, we wanted to keep the vibe of our home studio. So a unit next door became available. So we said, well, look, we could move into that. And so we basically built a studio. And Wolsey White, who produced the first album, to keep the ball from the door, but in between doing music, he worked in like the TV and film industry, build sets. So he was like, well, I can build the studio. So we thought, this is a great idea. Didn't think about it. So when the record label were pulling their hair out, because we were supposed to be working on the new album, but we were building this studio, and the producer was building the studio. He was in there with like 2x4 and plasterboard and fiberglass and all this sort of stuff. And like, so we started it late, but I don't think we didn't really, you know, we got to do things on that record. Like we went to, you know, we mixed it in Olympic Studios where, like, you know, the Stones did loads of their records, and we got strings. It was like we kind of did all the things that we couldn't have done on the first album.
We used the string arranger that like Richard Ashcroft and the Verve and that had used, which we always really liked. Massive Attack, you know, really cool. So we did loads of cool stuff. But I also think that some of it is just down to just the first album kind of thing. Like there are, you name me, like reel off bands that have had a successful first album. Sometimes it doesn't work like that. Sometimes they build. Sometimes it takes them until their third album. But if you have a big first album and a big second album and a second album that does the same or better, you're a rare creature. You really, really are. Because people are so attached to what you've done. When it's been really, really big and it's meant something to people, anything else is a deviation from what they've known, from what they love. It'd be like eating a biscuit, like you've got your favourite, I love this one, and then suddenly being told that, like, oh no, we've changed it, look, it's different. And you're like, but I want the old one, you know?
And now, the thing is,
it's a great analogy.
Now as well, you know, we kind of, you know, the album, that second album, for instance, and there was also the thing of, like, you know, all the people who kind of like were into what we were doing got to support us in press and radio and that kind of stuff. And come the second album, it was all the people who basically we somehow irked that we sort of like would talk about us, you know, and the whole artwork thing was just a kind of a good excuse to get. But the album went to number one. It went gold. You know, Suburban Nights is our highest charting single, right. And
Suburban
it's still
Nights is
one of our biggest live songs.
Suburban Nights is probably, if not the biggest live song. It's a huge live song. Again, it's a song that really connects to people. So, like, there are parts of that album that like people absolutely connect to and people really, really love. I think that we just did so well on our first one that it was almost impossible to repeat it.
There's a guy who came to I think it was the Glasgow show, who basically, we started playing I Shall Overcome, and he was like, he's got a tattoo of I Shall Overcome on his leg. And he said, this tune means so much to me. It's got me through. The amount of people who come up and talk about The King is like just, it's always that album, those songs that are the ones people mention.
Sure.
So yeah, it's just, it just works in different ways, I guess.
Going back to CCTV, pick me a couple of moments, favourite moments from the making of that album. It can be things you remember from the recording, it can be moments on the record, it can be whatever you fancy chatting about from the making of that. Let's go for one each. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go first.
Go on, Steve.
So rather than talking about, what great musical takes we did or anything like that, what I tend to remember about most things is the incidental stuff. So I remember making it. We'd get there in the morning, we'd get kind of sounds going and we'd do a few takes or whatever. And then we'd pause and go for this, like, imagine the most brutal all-day breakfast, English breakfast sandwich, basically, with, like, sausage and egg and bacon and, like, filth in it. If we had it now, at our age now, we'd immediately have a heart attack. But back then, we could do it, like, daily. And then you'd eat that, and it was like eating a bowling ball. And then you'd get back on the drums, and like, they'll give you the fuel for the rest of the day.
Where our studio was, there's nothing there. So there was a little wagon, wasn't there? And he'd turn up and he had some crazy, one of those crazy names, like Sizzlers or something like that.
Sizzlers,
and he would do these things. It was like a little treat, wasn't it? It was like a...
Oh, man. Yeah, treat yourself.
Could you tell the difference between the AM sessions and the PM sessions? Like this?
Definitely. Yeah. No, but like that's what I remember. You'd do that and then you'd be like, right, now I'm set up to go and like record the drums here. You'd just do it. So I remember that, definitely. It was definitely a no frills. In the years since, we've been to recording studios where they've had catering and stuff like that, where you get your 5 a day and, very nice kind of food. And this was not the case. Sizzlers wasn't doing that.
Pork-based five.
Yeah.
What about you, Rich? What do you remember from looking back into this album?
I mean, a lot of it is around, setting up the studio, and experimenting with that. I remember doing the vocal to Cash Machine and then putting a PA speaker out in the hall outside and recording the reverb and doing all that sort of stuff. But I think the main thing for me was so we got in there and then we'd met Wolsey, and the first track Wolsey mixed was Got a Reason. And when I heard that back, at first I was like, oh no, he's got this all wrong. And I was like, no, he's got it all right, actually, because it just suddenly sounded like a record. And it was at that moment, I was like, wow, something's going on, this is interesting, this could work out.
It suddenly became like sort of crunchy, if that's a musical term.
Yeah, because I used to use like a lot of reverb and delay, and he'd have none of that. It was all fuzz. It was like all overdrives, and he used to have this little dictaphone that he'd set to record. And I used to call it a waste of hard drive space because, obviously back then your hard drive was tiny. So we go, why are we recording that? It always sounds rubbish. But he was like, no, he puts it in there and it was all crunchy. And then we sort of found this middle ground and it was like, there we are, this is it now.
Yeah.
That was then like going around his little house in his bedroom where he'd mix tunes. And Cash Machine, I'd done this, it took me ages, this kind of like string arrangement with like sampled strings and filtering it and trying to make it sound like, a lot of the time we were trying to make it sound not like an indie rock record, but like, like Dr. Dre or something, like that was what we were trying to capture some of that.
Right.
And he got rid of it. And I was like, where's that? Where's the string bit I did? It took me hours. And he was like, wasn't really feeling it. And I was like, okay, well, could we not just put it in a little bit quietly? And then, we must have something there. And it was like, I've got this melodica, let's try that. And obviously that then became this sort of almost like a sound of the band, and it was like that kind of those little accidents, those little moments that change everything.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about this classic album, but we need to talk about the new stuff before we go. The new EP, Don't Go Making Other Plans, is in the world now. Listening to it, it feels like a more mature and older Hardfire, but also I think there's an element of familiarity about it. It feels like old Hardfire at the same time. Was that important when you were making this record? Because you talked about it stemmed from playing the old stuff. Did it need to fit together when you were going to be playing it live?
I don't know, because we've always had that question, We knew, like we've mentioned back in the day about, we knew that basically the label wanted us to make Cash to Beat for the weekend, basically over and over and over again. And we couldn't do that We probably tried just to get them off our back, but so it's always been about just making music, and just whatever comes out is it, because I think if you're trying to engineer something, it's just not going to work. You're not going to be into it. You're not going to spend the time on it. You're not going to give it the care it needs. So these are just the songs that seem to go, you know what, this is what's speaking at the moment. These seem to be working. And they came out like they did. Now, maybe because we'd been, looking at that earlier stuff, that's why they came out. But it wasn't a conscious thing. It was just kind of, there was an element of like, I don't want to put too much on it. I want to keep them quite stripped back. I don't have loads of stuff on there. Let's, really go through and like take everything off until we go, no, it definitely needs that. Which is something about the first album that was there by necessity.
Yeah. I think with time as well, I think you revert back to what you really are a little bit more. So when you make the second album, it's got to be a bit different, right? Or you try and make it exactly the same. You're trying to either replicate or make different. And then the third album is when, we went to like LA and stuff like that and had that kind of whole big rock and roll dream scenario, let's do something different again. And you're trying to like create different things. And then after a while, you just end up being like, well, who are we? Like, and then that just comes out, and it turns out that it's, it's familiar. There's stuff in there that's like that people can recognize because that's who we are.
You said last year, I think it was, when the idea of some kind of comeback was first mooted and you kind of hinted it might be happening, you said you had unfinished business. Is the tour you're on at the moment and the EP, is that the finishing of that business, or is it the start of a whole lot of new business?
I think it's just opening a can of worms. I don't know what, because it will obviously come back. It's quite hard coming back, if I'm honest. It's not like we could just jump into where we were. It's like I feel like we're starting a lot of things from the ground up. I think there's talk of a new album. I think that'll be something really interesting to get into. We've obviously got the anniversary of Stars of CCTV coming up, and we want to mark that somehow. I mean, the vinyl of Stars of CCTV goes on Discogs now for like over £100, right? Because, they only made so many of them, and in classic record label style, just as everyone started buying vinyl again, they stopped making it. So one of the things that's been really great about this new stuff is that, when the test pressing turned up, because we've had it, you can buy it on a translucent red 12-inch vinyl. So we got the test pressing through, and it's like, yes. We were always into that sort of culture, the second album probably sounded the way it did because we were trying to make it sound more like Massive Attack, or trying to make it sound more like Portishead or something like that, but with these sort of sensibilities from what we had before. So the whole vinyl thing, it was just like, this is kind of what excites us. So to just get that again, have that again was a great feeling, really exciting. So I think there's still more to do. It's just basically as long as, we're all into it and we're all happy doing it, and obviously people want to hear it. We're in the. I think the difference now is, like we said earlier, is that we're old enough now to realise that it isn't the end of the world. It isn't the be all or the be all and end all. It's like we do this because we enjoy it. If we're not enjoying it, don't do it. It's just life's too short.
Well, it's great to have you back making new music. If we get a new album next year, or if not, it's great to chat to you about this classic album. And I think the anniversary is a perfect opportunity to remind people exactly what a brilliant album is. So, Rich, Steve, thank you very much for joining me on the XS Long Player.
Thank you.
XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salverson. XS Manchester.
Brilliant chat with Rich and Steve. Brilliant album as well. I have gone back and listened to the whole of Stars of CCTV, and as a result of the conversation that I had with Rich and Steve, also got stuck into their second album, Once Upon a Time in the West, which is a belter, as well as their new stuff. The new EP is out now. Keep your eyes on the Hardfire website and socials, because it sounds like there are plans coming in 2025, so keep your ears and eyes peeled for that. And don't forget to go back into the back catalogue of the XS Long Player and find some of your favourite albums that we've talked about in great detail. Have a good one. I'll see you soon.
Manchester's indie rock and roll station, XS Manchester.